Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Today's founder is Morgan Lewis, the third governor of New York State. Now, it's easy to see how Morgan Lewis might be a founder when I tell you that his father, Francis Lewis, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Additionally, Elizabeth Lewis has her own fantastic story, being the wife of a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and she goes through great trials and tribulations, but that's a story for another time. Morgan Lewis, well, he spent his youth studying the law. He actually studies under John Jay, of all people, one of the best legal minds in American history, even though John Jay was only about a decade older than Morgan was. But once the war breaks out, Morgan decides to forego legalities and join the fight. And again, by just 22 years old, Morgan Lewis finds himself as a quartermaster general for the Northern Department of the Continental Army, which really was for General Schuyler, though he does find himself working as an aide-de-camp for General Horatio Gates early in the war. And he follows through the entire war, fights with the Continental Army throughout the Revolution. Now, as the 1780s progress, Morgan Lewis is now a young man. He gets that law degree and opens up a practice. He ends up getting elected to the state assembly for a bit, then the state senate, and then he becomes, in 1791, the Attorney General of New York State, and he holds this position for a full decade before he ends up running for governor of New York State. Now, what's really interesting about Morgan Lewis's campaign for New York State, well, this is New York State where former governor George Clinton is now running for vice president to replace current Vice President Aaron Burr, who is now running for governor of New York. And famously, it is this campaign that Aaron Burr runs that's the final straw between him and Alexander Hamilton coming to a duel. And the person Aaron Burr was running against was Morgan Lewis. And Aaron Burr lost, not just because the whole duel thing, but because Morgan Lewis ran a better campaign, and he was able to build a coalition of Democratic Republicans and Federalists. You see, it was at this time that the Democratic Party was the party. The Federalist Party was fairly obviously starting to fall apart, although that wouldn't come to fruition for about another 10 years fully. But the Federalist Party were having a lot of trouble, and New York was considered a swing state at the time. At least that's what we call it now. It's not what they called it at the time, but it was a very necessary state. That's why you kept getting vice presidents from New York, because those Virginians wanted to win New York to become president. Now, Morgan Lewis and Aaron Burr essentially split the party in half. One half is Lewisites, and the other half is called Clintonians. I know Aaron Burr's the one running, but they're more associated with current mayor of New York City and future governor of New York himself, DeWitt Clinton. Now, Morgan Lewis is a little bit more conservative in his outlook. That's why he's able to win the Federalist vote. Now, he sits there for 3 years. He serves a 3-year term as governor of New York, during which time some fascinating things happen. West Point is established in New York State. There are great overhauls in infrastructure, and public schooling is first begun to a very small scale in New York State, all under the watchful eye of Morgan Lewis. Then he runs again for mayor. This time he loses, but what's interesting about his 1807 campaign is now, instead of running against a sitting vice president, he runs against Daniel D. Tompkins, a future vice president of the United States of America. Yes, Morgan Lewis's campaigns were very heavily involved with vice presidents of the United States. Now, he does retire from public life at this point, and again, he's only approaching 40 when this happens, but a few years later, the War of 1812 breaks out, and Morgan Lewis is dedicated to his country and its cause. And actually, he's approached by President James Madison to take over as Secretary of War for the War of 1812. No small feat. The War of 1812 is obviously overlooked, despite it being an amazingly important development in early American history. And Morgan Lewis was asked to take charge of that war, and he actually turns it down because he thinks he'll be more service in New York State instead of going to Washington, D.C. First of all, he donates a ton of personal wealth to buy provisions for the cause. Additionally, he was a huge landowner, and at this point, New York is starting to come out of it, but it is still essentially a feudal system, as I like to talk about here, where wealthy people owned all the land, and they rented it out to tenant farmers. And what Morgan did is to help get people to join the war, is anyone who volunteered to fight, he would ease their rent both while they were away and after they returned for a certain amount of time to help incentivize them to join the fight. And a huge portion of the fighting was in New York. And in fact, Morgan Lewis also leads men in the field. He is soon appointed, first he's appointed quartermaster general of the entire army, because he had been a quartermaster general decades before as a young man in the Continental Army. Now he's the quartermaster general. Furthermore, he leads men in the field in the Niagara campaign, and during this time he is promoted to major general in the United States Army. He does a pretty good job. The men really seem to love him. It is questionable after the Battle of Fort George. He does tell everyone the Americans win, but it is arguable that if Winfield Scott had continued his campaign, he could have captured the major general in charge of the British Army. But Morgan Lewis, the superior officer at the time, orders them to stop as a caution measure. Now, he does get a little bit of criticism for this through military history, but in general, he was seen as a hero to the men who served underneath him, and should be seen as an American hero to those of us researching history in this fashion. Again, his biggest claim to fame is being third governor of New York, but after he leaves politics, he lives till the age of 89. So he lives for another 40 years, closing in on the Civil War. Most of the time, I don't want to say spent in retirement, but he leaves the law and becomes what he calls a farmer, but a major landowner in mid-Hudson area, Rhinebeck area, if you're familiar with that. So that is the story of Morgan Lewis, and a fascinating character of the American Revolution who I don't know of a biography being written on this gentleman, and he certainly deserves one. So if you want to write a biography, think about Morgan Lewis. If you want to subscribe to this channel, that's the best thing you can do. Thank you for watching. Definitely hit like if you enjoyed this. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel. I put out American Revolution content 7 days a week, and I'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.